Hey, and welcome to another episode of Coyotenomics. Today's topic we're covering is Man's Search for Meaning by Victor Frankl, one of the most important books of the 20th century, I would say.
And so the book we're going to be talking about today is Man's Search for Meaning by Victor Frankl. And I read this recently. Tyson has read it as well in the
Yes,
past, but
back in high school.
we're both fairly familiar with its contents. And basically, the book is written by a Nazi concentration camp survivor. Basically everyone in his family, other than his sister, passed away in the concentration camps, and he just survived this horrendous ordeal. And as a psychotherapist, he came out of it with a perspective on how to survive these intense times of life and what is most important essentially in life. And he came up with this theory that says that the fundamental driving force behind human beings is not necessarily a search for power, as people like Nietzsche said, or we're not driven by pleasure, like Freud said. We're actually driven by a search for meaning. And it is when we have this kind of sense of meaning in our life that we are most happy. And it's not when we're denied pleasure or power. It's when we have meaning that we are happy. Or it's not when we're denied these things, other things that we're unhappy. It's when we're denied meaning that we're unhappy. And this really speaks to me personally. If I look at my lowest point in my life, my lowest points in my life, it wasn't times where I had to work a grueling job or, it just wasn't necessarily eating good food. It was when I didn't have a purpose in my life. It didn't have a sense of meaning, was kind of just very depressed on that front. And the times sort of just most excited about life are often times where I was very physically exhausted and overworking myself, but I was fighting for something or pursuing something that I was very excited about. And so I definitely agree with the general thrust of what he's saying. And it's a great book because it's two parts. In the first half, he kind of talks about his personal experiences in the concentration camps and how he saw the role of meaning and the role of these values in helping certain people to survive. And the second half is more of an analytic approach to the whole thing. And after he survived this whole thing, he developed what he called logotherapy. And I guess logos or logo, I believe, translates to meaning. And so it's meaning-based therapy. And whereas other forms of therapy, they will look back into the past and encourage the patient to explore the source of what trauma initially caused these neuroses to unfold. He doesn't really worry about the past. He talks about right now, how can we contextualize your life or contextualize any suffering or hardship that you've undergone in a way that gives it meaning and essentially, allows you to better live happily. And it's great. It's sometimes in his advice, religion can play a role. Like he says, if the patient is religious, that can be useful in essentially tapping into their form of meaning, but it's not necessary. And it basically is a very patient-specific recipe for what provides them meaning. Let's explore that and let's kind of use that because, people are different and they have their own perspective on these things. And I have just a few general notes and talking points that I wanted to jump off of, but is there anything you wanted to toss in, Tyson? Or?
No, I think good so far.
Cool.
It's a pretty high level, good high level.
Yeah. One thing he points out, which
a pickle jar too?
I am. We're both drinking pickle jar water at the moment. It's 2020.
Yeah, man. Struggle life.
Did you say muggle life?
I said struggle life.
Okay, like muggle life. Sure. I mean, I am a muggle. It's true. He mentions that, and this is something I very much agree with, that many people fall into periods of depression when they're laid off or when they find themselves in unemployment or when they retire, or even people when they leave prison. They often will become very depressed and often suicidal, because the whole goal when you're in prison is often to get out. And then once you're out, if you haven't established any sort of alternative framework for what gives you meaning, then you're left in a vacuum, and that can be very devastating for certain people. And actually, the Gulag Archipelago, which I also read relatively recently, talks about how certain people who finally got out of the gulags after 20 years would often commit suicide at that point. And it's just insane until you realize that their entire psyche was built around surviving. And then when they didn't have that in their life anymore, then yeah, oftentimes that's just such a blow. And one thing that occurred to me is that while most people in the gulags didn't survive, they estimate that at least 5 out of 6 people died in the gulags who were sent. At least they promised people that they would get out, and that promise that people would get out offered a great sense of meaning, apparently. And the author of the Gulag Archipelago actually attributes the very low suicide rate in the camps to that fact. And so I believe that that was probably the greatest, that was the way in which the gulags were much more civilized or much more humane than the concentration camps, is that they actually promised you would get out, even if you wouldn't generally, at least you had that belief, whereas the concentration camps offered nothing. They offered almost no hope, and there was a belief that you would very likely die. And it was in this complete vacuum of any possibility of meaning that you were essentially tested the most to find meaning. And Victor Frankl explores how, yeah, even in this kind of context where there's seemingly no hope, meaning can be created. And if it can form during the Holocaust, it can form anywhere, essentially. And if people can find meaning to life and a reason to live and a way to be happy during that time, they can find it during any time. And so for that reason, his book is very celebrated and thought of very highly. And he's given more street cred as a Holocaust survivor. So he mentions that there are a few different ways to, he says there are 3 roads to find meaning in your life. The first one is in creation. If you have an important work that you're working on, some book, like for him, he had this book that he was working on in the concentration camp, and that provided a great deal of meaning. Or it could be like you're trying to you're trying to build something that's very important to you. The second one is experience. That could be some experience in nature is very profound to you and that pulls you through, or you have someone you love and that relationship with them gives you meaning in those darkest of times. And I could probably think of more examples, but I think you get the picture. And then the third one is even in suffering. In suffering, you can find a way to contextualize it, to give it meaning. And that's what oftentimes people had to do in the concentration camps, because when they were exposed to barbaric treatment and torture, they had to essentially find a way to make their suffering meaningful. And oftentimes that was religious, and oftentimes it was to view it, it was viewed that to suffer with your head held high or to do it nobly is much better than to do it in a way that is self-degrading. And so even just the act of trying to endure it nobly was something that was seen as something that gave meaning, and to many people it did. But that's obviously the most grim of examples, and usually you can find some sliver of meaning besides just suffering in a certain way. Yeah, he gave a few interesting examples of where after he left the camps and he started his practice of logotherapy, where he gave advice to patients and various people who would come to him for help. He had one man who his wife had passed away many years ago, and he could not get over it. It was a very just devastating loss, and he was very, very heartbroken. And he couldn't figure out how he just couldn't figure a way to make the hurt go away, essentially. And Viktor Frankl's advice was, well, he started by asking, how would your wife have felt if you passed away first and she was left alone instead, like the other way around? And he said, well, that would be awful for her. She would be just as devastated as I am. And yeah, it would just be awful. And Viktor Frankl pointed out that in a sense, you have saved her this hardship, and your suffering is almost a price to pay for preventing her from going through what you are having to go through. And with that, the man just apparently stood up and shook his hand and left. And that was something that was very profoundly meaningful to him. And it might sound a little bit trite and kind of just like an excuse or like a concocted rationalization, but at the end of the day, sometimes that's what you need. When people are truly suffering and in a very dark place, you need to find a way that gives meaning to their suffering. And one quote that I really liked is, in some sense, suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as it has meaning. And I think that's really true. And that if you can give meaning to it, then it doesn't feel nearly as awful. And I'm just going to kind of plow on ahead, but if there's anything you want to jump in with,
I have
Tyson?
questions, but I'll like save them for the end.
Cool.
Good.
Yeah, sounds good. He made one point about collective responsibility that I really liked. Victor Frankl was German, and he just didn't like the whole concept of collective responsibility or collective blame. And many people took him to task over the fact that he continued to teach and write in German, which was the language of his supposed oppressors and the people who murdered his family. And when they made that point, he would often make the point of, tell me, do you have any knives in your kitchen? And when they said yes, he would say, how could you keep around these tools of destruction that have been used to murder so many innocent lives? And I thought that was a great little rebuttal to the belief in collective responsibility. So I just wanted to toss that out there. Another quote that I really liked was, man's role is not to endure the meaninglessness of existence. It is to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. It's kind of a mouthful, but I just thought it was rather poignant. And the central kind of tenet of logotherapy, or one of the principles, is this idea that you should live as you were living for this. Live as if you were living for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now. So imagine that you've already lived this entire life through to your death, and then you were able to somehow go back in time and live it over again, and you're about to act just as poorly as you did the last time, but this time you have a chance to act differently and to make a different choice. And it's really obviously a very empowering thought. It brings home the notion of that we have free will and aren't just kind of caught in a current. And that's the main thrust of what he wrote about that I thought was very interesting. He also talked about a concept called anticipatory anxiety, which I thought was very interesting. As more of a side note, I'm not sure how this directly ties into his theory of logotherapy, but it was talked about in the book, and I thought it was very interesting, so I'll share that as well. That's the idea that sometimes when people are very anxious about something, that anxiety will make the action that they're anxious about all the more difficult. A classic example is when you're trying to fall asleep, and the knowledge that you have less and less time to sleep before work tomorrow makes you all the more anxious and all the more difficult to fall asleep. And it's kind of this awful feedback loop where you spiral down into insomnia. One example he gave was when this boy who would sweat a lot, and he would sweat so profusely, just whenever he'd be concerned about sweating, he would start sweating all the more.
Yeah. And
his therapy for this is what he calls paradoxical intention, which is essentially intend the very thing that is feared. So for the case of the man who was sweating profusely, he would say, okay, now I'm going to show how much I can truly sweat. Normally I sweat a quart. I'm going to show that I can sweat 2 quarts this time. And when he would actually try to demonstrate his sweating ability, it would go away completely, apparently.
Yeah.
And this is obviously applying to a specific type of anxiety or a specific type of disorder, if you want to call it that. It doesn't work for all things, but essentially it can work quite well for certain things. Another interesting example that he mentioned was a boy who had a debilitating stutter, and he stuttered all of his life. He couldn't remember one memory in which he didn't stutter except for one. And that was when he had been trying to ride a train without a ticket, and the conductor caught him. And he thought, my only way out of this is to appeal to his sympathies and to stutter and be this kind of mess. And he tried to stutter and he couldn't. And that's just a classic example of the therapy in action, but not pursued with knowledge of it. And this has the greatest application in sexual dysfunction, like impotence or difficulty orgasming. Lots of patients who have this desire to, I'm going to display my sexual prowess, they will become much more, just more impotent rather than actually enjoying the experience. And it makes the point that oftentimes, pleasure should not be pursued for pleasure's sake. It should be an extension of something that you're engaging in. And oftentimes, if you pursue the actual pleasure itself, then it kind of undermines the whole psychological process, I suppose.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the main thrust of the book. It's not a very long book, so that's kind of what I mainly wanted to talk about. But I know Tyson has some questions, and we can probably.
I have one that my 11th grade English teacher asked me when I read Man's Search for Meaning that I've been dying to ask you, which is, what do you think are the precedents of this idea? Like, I think it was written in 1947, the first publication was, or whatever. But like, are there like is it a historical like concept going all the way back, or is it really some new idea that he created himself? Like,
it's a good question.
Of, like older works or like ancient scholars or anything like that sort of like you tie to those ideas
that echo the same sentiments.
Yes.
I think
perhaps he drew from, or like are part of the same school of thought, might say, or is it like a new concept?
I'm definitely not. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself, well educated enough to say anything with confidence, but I certainly was reminded of Stoicism and the classic philosophy of Stoicism a lot through reading this, and the idea that what's the term? Like tragic optimism, that came up a lot in this book, the term tragic optimism, and the idea that you should be very grounded in the gritty reality of what is around you and the worst possible scenario, and to be grounded in the fact that even if that happens, I can endure and survive and find meaning and happiness. And the worst that can happen is survivable, essentially, but also try to, within that very grounded context, contain a little bit of optimism and persevere with that positive outlook. And that, I think, is obviously very difficult, but that's a balance that he tries to draw in this book in a lot of his advice. And that seems to me, based on my very kind of superficial understanding of Stoicism, seems to be a very central idea of Stoicism. And
finding meaning in like overcoming adversity and like
and being very present in that sort of that hardship rather than trying to escape it.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't really have like a better answer than that. I just thought it was an interesting question. It's one that stuck in my mind as soon as you mentioned you were reading it. So.
Cool, yeah. And that is something that he mentions a lot as well, is the idea that certain people in the camps would often engage in escapism, where they would essentially try to, I guess there's different forms of this. Like, he would often talk to his wife, and he maintained the belief that she was alive. It turned out that actually she had passed away in the camp, another camp, but he had the belief that she was alive, and he would have an ongoing dialogue with her. And he actually believed that even if he knew she had passed away, he would have received just as much comfort from having a dialogue with her, like internalized self within him. And that idea of finding ways to escape in various ways was just such a huge part of that. And it's obviously but at the same time, certain people who, like, you need to find in some way be grounded in your reality. And he made the point that there are many ways to make your life better in the concentration camps. Even in this horrible scenario, you're able to find ways to improve upon your lot. And if you're too much engaged in escapism, you tend to spiral downwards. And he found that there's a point at which he could recognize when someone was too divorced from their situation, that he could recognize that they were going to be not long for this world, so to speak, and that they were on their way out because they were too lost in their own desperate need to escape, rather than finding some sort of meaning in the grim reality at hand.
Have you ever seen the film, I believe it's called Life is Beautiful?
Yeah.
That's what another one that it reminded me of, like kind of this idea of like sort of, and he dies at the end. Oh, sorry, spoilers for people. refusable, but like just like that he found meaning in like bringing happiness to the people around him, even though like he ended up dying and like was punished and like the guards didn't like it and stuff like that. Like I don't know, it's kind of a similar idea.
Yeah, and actually, that I was reminded of another thing that he talked about in the book, which was a lot of the people in the camps who, like, there's this idea in popular culture that you should be happy, and obviously, in some sense, it's a good idea. Like, it's enshrined in the American system in the pursuit of happiness, and in lots of societies, especially in modern Western society, the pursuit of happiness is seen as being very central. And yeah, obviously, in a way, that's good, but also we need to find a way to derive. We need to find a way of finding values that supersede that, because especially in the camps, like the people who just wanted to be happy and had no values beside that, they ended up being the people who would sell out the other prisoners for a small portion of benefit. They would be the
Yeah.
stool pigeons and the gulags. They would be the people who essentially, yeah, they sold out their fellow humans and for a tiny sliver of pleasure or contentment. And they obviously often ended up being like incredibly tortured, and in some sense that's maybe a better route to survival, and in a purely Darwinian sense that's a better strategy in that context. But in terms of maintaining humanity or happiness, or according to Viktor Frankl, what makes you happy in life, meaning in a long term, that's a terrible way to go. And I think it's a great just example of the shortcomings of what might be called hedonism. Just this idea that happiness is the prime directive or the highest value, the highest goal. We need to find something beyond that, because that's not a very good goal. And I think if you live your life in a very hedonistic way, it can be kind of, in a very shallow way, enjoyable. But I think that it declines in value over time, and you find yourself in a very meaningless situation. And I've definitely lived in a very, hedonistic, I don't care about anything besides this very nihilistic point in my life. And I definitely find that it's not as exciting as it might look on paper, because yeah, truly what makes you more happy is actually finding something that you're excited about in a, I don't know, more overarching sense.
So kind of not necessarily as a challenge, but as like another way of thinking about it. So like Viktor Frankl himself, and obviously we mentioned it too, like the contrast between uh, this sort of idea and like the Freudian idea of like pleasure seeking and the Nietzschean idea of like power, the thirst for power. And like perhaps it is important that like all of those forces are present in our society. And like it does help us that like certain people, like, we can all think of people in our life that are very hedonistic, and they tend to be like, those are not going to be perhaps the most sustained, productive relationships of your life, but they are enjoyable. Often those are the people that push your boundaries and things like that. And on the other side, there are like, people, more Nietzschean types that maybe push you or like stop you from going down dark paths or things like that. And perhaps it's important that like we have a variety of people seeking after a variety of different things, and that like, maybe that is the ultimate best approach, or even like the same people seeking different things at different points in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think it should be noted that, yeah, while, pursuit of pleasure and other things are very important, yeah, even things like pursuit of power is obviously very important. You can't do much in your life if you don't have power in some form, whether it be money or social power or whatever it may be. But
Absolutely.
a power is a means to an end, and if you don't have that means, then you can't really pursue much. And so, yeah, this book is more about the pursuit of, I think, a fulfilling life and long-term meaningful happiness. And
Yeah.
but I absolutely agree that they're all part of a full human being.
Totally. Like, kind of what I was getting at is like the sort of modern critique of that is that you can't, like, not everyone can be an artist. Like, you do need people that just, like, you know, do meaningless jobs to sort of sustain society and things like that. And there can be a map of, like, you know, perhaps not everyone can spend their whole life seeking after some, like, pure purpose, lest like we need to keep the lights on and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like maybe it's good to have people seeking after a variety of different things.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And cool. Do you have any additional thoughts about this?
So the big one is like, how do you find meaning in your life? And like, specifically, I'm interested, like, if you feel like the things that give you your life meaning have changed over time, or if you look back and see sort of like a common thread of like something you've always come back to, or is it something that shifts as you age? Like, oh yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
That's a really cool question, and I'm going to ask you the same question afterwards.
Yeah.
So,
I have
from
5 minutes to open the answer.
yeah, for myself, I absolutely, when I was about 18 or so, I started to develop a sense of what my own values and beliefs were, and I definitely developed a more concrete sense of meaning in my life. And I developed the belief that ideas shape the world in a profound way, and it's not necessarily any authority figures or anything like that shape the world. It's the ideas held in the popular consciousness of the public at large. And if we can affect the ideas, like if we can inspire people to no longer think slavery is a good idea, then slavery will go away. It's all in here. And so I developed the belief that philosophy was profoundly important. And I started a YouTube channel where I would chat about philosophy and all the ideas that were interesting to me. And yeah, that brought me profound meaning at that period of my life. And I ended up getting depressed and nihilistic for a variety of reasons, and ended up stopping doing that. And I think, and also I developed the belief that many people aren't nearly as willing to change or consider perspectives as I thought they were. And I became very cynical about people's ability to just listen to perspectives and take in information. And so I stopped doing it. But I think fundamentally, even if through doing videos like this or having conversations with you, Tyson, even if I don't really affect the world at all, even making the attempt in some form, that makes me feel so much better about myself. And yeah, so it's kind of the thing where the act of trying to affect the world through the, putting ideas out there, I think is what brings me the most meaning, because I believe that if anything's going to change the world, it's not going to be violence or wars or occupations. It's going to be conversation, empathic conversation. And so I would say the idea of trying to talk to people about things that are important in the world.
Are there like, I'll answer after this one more question, but like, are there like heroes of that sort of like vein that you look to and you're like, those are like, that's an example of what I'm trying to be? Or do you sort of have like your own recipe of something that you're trying to become?
Yeah, absolutely. I have heroes. I mean, one of my first heroes in this area was James Randi. He recently passed away. And I used to watch videos of him just kind of traveling around. And his way of communicating was always so warm and empathic and kind, which I always thought was just great. And he challenged a lot of new age pseudoscience in a way that was very palatable and fun. And I thought that was really cool. But yeah, I find generally my heroes these days are pretty much anyone who is willing to put themselves out there in a socially risky way to push ideas that they see as necessary or important. And there are so many people like that in the world. I mean, it's really hard to come up with a shorter list, but a lot of these public intellectuals who take a social hit for their
yes, like people willing to say unpopular things.
Yeah, and especially if they're able to do it in a way that's empathic and warm, but they don't get torn down by the vitriol they're exposed to for doing that. They maintain standards of discourse and dialogue, which is something I don't always do. Sometimes I get, caught up in the dirty hate machine of online social media, and it's great. And those people who are able to rise above it are the best of the best in my mind. And yeah, those are generally my heroes, are people who are willing to talk about things controversial, and especially people who can somehow find the strength to do it in a friendly way.
That's awesome. James Randi is a great guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, for yourself, what would you say is the arc of what gave Tyson meaning?
So I gave this some thought this week because I wanted to have a good answer. And the answer that I ultimately came to kind of surprised me because it wasn't really where I thought I was going to go to. But like, I guess what has really given me meaning is this idea of like, in a world of conformity, I think it is important that people are willing to serve as the example of like alternatives, that like you don't have to live the same way that like society is telling you to live. You don't have to make the sacrifices, both moral and personal, that like society is telling you to make. And it's important, even if like I live under no misunderstanding that people are like looking to me as like a guideline of how to live their life. But like just the idea that someone could look out there and see that there's people doing other things and living like non-traditional lifestyles and like being moderately successful at it is like, I think, inspirational to like everyone, that like we don't have to be a cog in the machine. And I take a lot of like, pride is a bad word, but like pride in being somebody who like, you know, told a lot of authority figures in my life to fuck off and like still managed to like scrap a life together that I can be proud of. And like that's something that brings me a lot of meaning. And the idea of like having kids and being able to tell them like there are other options. Certainly there's no shame in like living a normal life, but like you can go out there and be weird and live for weird ideas, and like they won't just stomp the square peg into the round hole, you know, like that you
Yeah,
can triumph over adversity. So that's something that I feel brings me a lot of meaning in my life.
that's awesome. Yeah, and I do think having those role models or whatever you want to call them out there in the world is very important, because a lot of people,
Yeah,
they don't see those out there, and they assume, well, there's only one way to live because this is all, like, all the successful strategies I see are this way, and seeing certain successful strategies that don't follow that particular approach, I
exactly.
think, is very empowering for someone, especially growing up.
And kind of like thinking about the negative thought, which is that like people look out there and they're like, wow, I don't see anybody doing this. It must not work. Like it's important that people are willing to be that guy and be like, yeah, it does work. Like it might not be like I'm not the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or anything, but like I've done okay enough that like other people could do the same thing, you know?
Yeah, you seem to live just fine. Absolutely.
Yeah, just fine is a good way to put it.
Yeah, like you're not, yeah, you're
Yeah.
not struggling. I guess we all are in some sense, but
Yeah. And like something that inspired me to sort of live a life like that is like when reading about, again, like a lot of intellectuals, and probably not necessarily the same ones, but like when you read about a lot of like the famous philosophers of history, they were like weird, abnormal people who were just like able to sequester the space they needed to do their thing. And like that was something that was always an inspiration to me. Like you hear the story, like I've talked about Archimedes pretty much every episode, but there's the stories of like Archimedes like running down the street naked, and like the soldiers come to like arrest him, and he's telling them that they're disturbing his diagrams in the sand and everything, and like he just like lives a weird life and is allowed to do it. And like, you know, Immanuel Kant is the same way, Descartes is the same way. Like these people were just able to be obnoxiously weird because like they were dedicated to it and willing to like pay for it with like their brilliance or whatever. And that's
yeah,
something that like I think I hope more people do that, because I think conforming stamps that brilliance out of you.
yeah, I think there's a huge pressure to, yeah, not necessarily, yeah, breach the, like, straight and narrow road. And yeah, I think
Exactly.
that's awesome.
I don't blame anybody. I'm not like condemning anybody for making choices. Like there's nothing wrong with taking an easier path, especially if you have a family or whatever. But like just as like a bright-eyed 15-year-old, like there were weirdos in my life that I looked to and I was like, yeah, like I can be weird too. I don't have to be a suit. Like I can be something else.
Yeah, no, I do think it's really important to just show that there are lots of alternatives. There's lots of ways to live, and seeing those examples out there is great.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well,
I think
I feel
that's
like, pardon?
I said that's my notes that I had.
Sweet. Well, I feel like that feels like a pretty good. I don't know
Yeah.
if you have any. Do you have any? Do you want to do the final thoughts, or are we ready for that point? Or
Yeah, we could probably do final thoughts.
yeah, I don't want to. I mean, we could do a longer video because we normally do longer videos, but I hate to stretch it if there's no kind of organic mean reason to do so. So
Yeah. I mean, we always have the Gulag Archipelago to revisit like a lot of the same ideas. So
yeah, Yeah, I'm gonna do that on a second video. But I was blown away by the Gulag Archipelago, and I want to give it justice. So I'm gonna take my time with trying to distill my thoughts on that. But
I guess
yeah.
like one final point I'll raise, and
Mhm.
this is just a brief point, but like all three of Freud, Frankl, and Nietzsche came up, like not necessarily all at the same time, but like all came up in that similar atmosphere of like the rising German state and everything. And do you think that's like a coincidence, or do you think there was something about that environment that like sort of unifies all three of them, or drove all three of them to produce the ideas they did? Like they invite the comparison between the three of them is the only way I'll make it.
Yeah,
And like all three of them lived in the same country within 50 years of each other. Like
absolutely. Yeah, and actually that reminds me of something else I wanted to mention as well. But so thank you. But I
yeah,
would say I would guess that it was some reflection of the intellectualism that existed at the time in Germany. I think it was just a very intellectual place. I think there's a temptation to say that the adversity of the time, it kind of, or the context of the German state gave rise to that. I don't personally believe that, but I'm also not really sure. I know there's a lot of just, I think the German culture probably had more to do with it, and their respect and admiration for ideas and thinking and intelligence and education.
I would agree with that. I would sort of lob out there that in Germany in particular, but also just in the world at that time, like genetics was very much an emerging science, and all three of them like present these ideas of sort of like what you're born with. And like obviously like Freud and Frankl were affected by it differently than Nietzsche, who is in many ways a founding father of those sorts of beliefs. But like just like growing up in that environment of like what do we come into our life with, and like what do we leave it with, and like it invites the question of like what is the purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I guess one other point that he mentioned in the book that I think should be acknowledged is that there's a temptation to think as well that suffering gives rise to meaning, and that suffering is maybe a useful thing to endure or to even inflict upon people to inspire meaning in their lives. But something he stresses very a lot in the book, very a
yeah,
lot, is that stressing or suffering is not necessary for any of this. And if suffering is unnecessary or avoidable, the meaningful thing to do would be to stop the suffering. And it's only when you know that the suffering is necessary or unavoidable that you're able to contextualize it in a way that actually gives it, a meaning that is endurable. But yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that
yeah,
yes, yeah, and I think absolutely that it is also true that in our more primitive history, we were faced with a more inherent struggle, like to live and survive demanded more of us. And so that struggle that we were faced with in the daily fight for survival offered a sort of meaning in and of itself. And in our more Western opulent society, we are we don't have that anymore. And so we have a lot more of this search for meaning and this existential despair. And he definitely says a lot that boredom is the source of so much of this sort of emptiness in our lives. And I think it's incumbent upon us in this modern age that we live in, where we're given so much, that we now we have to actively find ways to give ourselves meaning rather than just be given it through the daily struggle of existence. And I think that's very interesting.
absolutely. Are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, it's like a similar concept. Like as
totally.
you move up the pyramid, like in some sense, like he called it self-actualization or whatever you want to call it, but like finding meaning is perhaps like the ultimate drive. But many people maybe don't get to that point because
Yeah,
point they're trying to feed themselves. So
yeah. Their kid has lupus and they're trying to swim to the other side of the ocean on the
yeah,
tiny canoe and well, whatever. I'm just, yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's,
To your point about suffering, I think he would appreciate if we mentioned that he started writing it before he was ever in an internment camp. It talks about in the
yeah,
book a lot about how he protected his writings and like tried to stop the guards from seizing them and stuff like that because like it was already a very important idea to him at that point.
absolutely. Yeah, these didn't
Not
necessarily
something,
come.
yeah,
Yeah,
it didn't emerge from the Holocaust. It
yeah.
was certainly it was affected by, but not like, created in that.
Yeah, in some sense, it provided the ultimate test for the validity of his ideas,
for sure.
but didn't give birth to them necessarily. And and I guess, and one of the things he mentions is just the theme of being responsible, and responsibleness is the core of what drives meaning for lots of people. And just this idea that it's good to be free, and freedom is very important, but in addition to freedom, perhaps we should idealize things like responsibility in, many cultures like American culture, where like modern Western culture, where freedom is idealized. I certainly do that. Perhaps we need to rekindle our appreciation and our devotion to responsibility, and the act of taking responsibility for something very much brings meaning into your life.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's it.
Okay.
So I will hand it off to you if you'd like for final thoughts on this.
I go first?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. I guess my final thoughts are that it is a very useful and productive exercise to like regularly assess what gives you meaning for life, and like if your life is bringing you meaning or if you need to make changes. It's very, momentum is a very powerful force among human beings, and you'll tend to stay in the same place that you are unless you make big efforts to change it. So take the time to assess if your life brings you meaning, happiness, and whatever else. And the unexamined life is not worth living. There's my final thought.
Cool, very nice. Always end with a quote.
There you go.
And I would say that, I was just very much struck more than anything in the book by his criticism of hedonism and the mindless pursuit of happiness above all else. And I think it's very tempting in our society to just focus on what makes us happy rather than what brings us meaning, or what is important in a more foundational sort of way. And I think there's a huge temptation to focus on happiness at the expense of other things. And I think it just leads you to this kind of a downward spiral in a sense. And I don't think I'm going to get more profound than that. So I'm just going to, I think I'll leave it there. And thank you very much for joining us.
Catch you coyotes next time.